They sailed in search of a passage through ice, but found only hunger, mutiny, and death. In 1611, Henry Hudson vanished into the Arctic wilderness, abandoned by his own crew. This is the chilling true story of ambition, betrayal, and the last voyage of a doomed explorer. The 17th century was an age of maps with blank spaces and fortunes waiting to be found in the void. Across Europe, merchants and monarchs dreamed of a sea route that could slice through the northern top of the world. A shortcut to China, bypassing the long contested voyages around Africa or through the Americas. The route was hypothetical. The ice was unforgiving. But the prize? Limitless. Among those chasing it was a man named Henry Hudson, navigator, explorer, risk-taker. A man destined to disappear into the very mystery he spent his life pursuing. Little is known about Hudson's early years. Born in England sometime in the late 1560s or early 1570s, he rose from obscurity at a time when skilled navigators were in high demand. He studied the stars, the winds, the tides. He read accounts of earlier voyages, Frobisher, Davis, Cabot, all of whom had tried and failed to find a northwest passage to Asia. Hudson believed the route was real, and more than that, he thought he could find it. In 1607, backed by the Muscovy Company, he set sail north, not west, hoping to reach Asia by sailing over the Arctic Circle. He didn't find a passage, but he pushed farther into the ice than most before him, encountering whales, glaciers, and endless daylight. That voyage, and another the following year, established Hudson as a man willing to gamble everything for discovery. By 1609, his reputation caught the attention of the Dutch East India Company, then Europe's rising commercial titan. They hired him to find a northeast route once more. The ice blocked his way, again, so he turned the ship around and sailed west, without orders, to the coast of North America. He explored the river that now bears his name, the Hudson, sailing far into the continent and claiming lands for the Dutch that would one day become New York. Though he didn't find a passage, he saw something else, a second chance. Back in England, however, his unsanctioned deviation into Dutch service nearly cost him his standing. Suspicion lingered. Trust was fractured. But Hudson, ever the persuader, secured one more opportunity. This time, it would be his final voyage. In 1610, with funding from a group of English investors, Hudson was placed in command of a small vessel, the Discovery. The mission was clear: enter the northern seas, find the elusive passage, and open a new chapter in global trade. He departed from London in April with a crew of 22. Among them, his teenage son, John Hudson, veteran seaman Robert Jute, and a mix of seasoned mariners and untested youth. Their destination? Unknown waters. Their odds? Unknowable. The stakes were enormous. Success meant unimaginable wealth, faster routes to silk, spices, and porcelain. Failure meant frozen death. But Hudson was not the kind of man who feared failure. His eyes were on the map, on the margins, on the sea that had not yet been named. He believed the northern passage could be found, not in summer breezes and open bays, but through courage, cold, and calculation. The DD Discovery cut through the Atlantic, sailed past Greenland, and turned into the vast icy expanse that later became known as the Hudson Strait. From here, they would enter waters no European had ever mapped. The men aboard the D Discovery were uneasy. Icebergs drifted silently past. Fog closed in. The sun vanished for days. Hudson, however, saw only opportunity. In his journal, he described the beauty of the ice, the sharpness of the air, the stillness of the water. But he also knew what the ice could do. He had seen it lock ships in place, crack hulls, starve men. Still, he pressed forward. In late summer, the ship emerged into an enormous inland sea, what we now call Hudson Bay. Hundreds of miles across, ringed by wild shoreline and seemingly endless. To Hudson, it was the breakthrough he had waited his whole life to find. He believed he had done it. Found the passage, crossed the threshold. History was within reach. But as the days shortened and the water chilled, reality would come crashing in. There was no way out of the bay. The passage, if it existed, lay beyond ice and hunger. Winter was coming. The ice would close in. The Discovery was alone in a frozen world. And Henry Hudson, the dreamer, the navigator, the man with his name written on rivers and maps, would soon face a fate more terrible than he had ever imagined. Not from the ice, but from his own crew. In late July 1610, after weeks of navigating uncharted seas, the Discovery emerged into an expanse so vast, so open, and so still that the men on deck could scarcely believe it was not the ocean itself. They had passed through a narrow, treacherous waterway now known as Hudson Strait, a bottleneck of ice floes, unpredictable currents, and grinding cold. And beyond it lay something no European had yet seen, a massive inland sea, Hudson Bay. Henry Hudson was ecstatic. He believed they had found it, the long-sought northern passage to Asia. A body of water this large must, he thought, lead somewhere. A hidden river, a corridor to the Pacific, the Silk Road reborn in ice. He named it not for himself, but as a gift to his financiers. The Great Bay of Discovery. The Discovery, a ship no longer than 55 feet and barely seaworthy by modern standards, had pushed farther than any English vessel before. The crew, a mix of veterans and youth, loyalists and skeptics, had begun the voyage with doubts. But now, as the sea opened before them, even the doubters dared to hope. They explored the western shores, hugging the landline near what is now Manitoba. The bay, as it turns out, was not the narrow channel Hudson imagined. It was vast, nearly 1 million square kilometers in size, ringed by barren coastline and dark forests. At first, it was exhilarating. Then, it became a maze. Hudson, obsessed with discovery, ordered the ship to push deeper. He dismissed warnings about the oncoming autumn. He ignored the crew's growing concern about dwindling supplies. Every inlet, every cove, every stretch of icy shoreline was scoured for a westward outlet. None appeared. Still, he refused to turn back. By early September, the signs were clear. The water had grown colder. Daylight began to shrink. Geese and other birds flew south in significant numbers. The stars rose more slowly, and frost clung to the rigging each morning. Winter was coming. But Hudson refused to retreat. He believed the passage lay just beyond the next bend, the next peninsula, the next storm. He had risked everything, his name, his son, his crew, on this moment. To turn back now would mean returning to England without the glory he had promised, without proof, without triumph. So they sailed on. The crew grew restless. Robert Jute, the experienced but sullen mate, had sailed with Hudson before, and had clashed with him before. On earlier voyages, Jute had nearly been dismissed for insubordination. Now, he warned that Hudson's stubbornness would trap them all. Hudson refused to listen. For him, discovery was not a direction. It was a destiny. But for the crew, it was a death sentence waiting in the ice. On September 10th, they anchored in a small bay, today known as James Bay, at the southern end of the Hudson Bay Basin. The land was bleak. The temperature dropped sharply. Ice formed at the edges of the water. Then came the words no sailor wanted to hear. The ship is frozen in. The Discovery would not sail again until spring. They would have to overwinter in the Arctic, with no outpost, no allies, and no guarantee of survival. The dream of discovery had become a prison of cold. Hudson tried to maintain morale. He recorded the weather. He planned for hunting. He assigned duties. But food was scarce. Fresh water was limited. The game disappeared. The endless cold gnawed at flesh and spirit. Still, he spoke of spring, of the passage, of victory. To Hudson, the Great Bay was not a mistake. To the crew, it was a grave. As snow blanketed the land, silence fell over the discovery. The logbooks tell us little, and much was likely never written down. But fragments remain. Scurvy took hold. Hunger became constant. Men argued in hushed tones. Eyes narrowed. Knives were cleaned a little too often. And in the hearts of some, a terrible thought began to grow. Would all of them return? Henry Hudson had found what others had only dreamed of, a route into the center of the northern continent. But it was not a gateway. It was a cul-de-sac of ice. A mistake that would cost him everything. He didn't know it yet. But his name, etched into rivers, straits, and bays, would be all that remained. Because the discovery would leave the bay the following spring. But he wouldn't be on it. As October 1610 sank into November, the discovery sat still, trapped in thickening sheets of ice near the southern edge of Hudson Bay. Wind howled across the deck. Rigging snapped in the cold. The bay, which had seemed so promising only weeks before, now looked more like a punishment than a discovery. There would be no escape before spring. The Arctic was closing its hand. Henry Hudson still clung to optimism. He had convinced himself that a passage existed beyond the maze of islands and inlets. The ice, he believed, was only a seasonal setback. Once the thaw came, they would push farther west, through the Grand Bay and into the fabled sea beyond. But his men did not share his faith. They saw only the snow, the dwindling food barrels, the frozen horizon, and they began to count the days rather than the distances. The crew scrambled to prepare for the long, brutal winter. They constructed makeshift shelters from sailcloth and timber. They hunted what little game could be found: hares, ptarmigan, the occasional seal. Traps were set along the shore, but more often than not, they returned empty. The men rationed every biscuit, every ounce of dried meat, every splash of fresh water melted from snow. The cold preserved their hunger, but not their hope. Below deck, the air turned sour. The wooden walls dripped with condensation. Mildew crept into every blanket. And in the cramped, unlit hold, resentment festered. Hudson tried to maintain order. He kept charts, measured the stars, wrote in his logbook with stiff fingers. But even his most loyal supporters began to question his judgment. His teenage son, John Hudson, stood by him, quiet, dutiful, watching. But others whispered, especially Robert Jute, the bitter mate who had once been dismissed for insubordination, and now had the ear of half the crew. Jute had seen enough ice, enough failure, enough cold promises. He began to speak openly of the captain's errors, of the bay that led nowhere, of the death that surely waited if they followed Hudson any farther. By December, scurvy had taken hold. Gums blackened, teeth loosened, wounds refused to heal. The men huddled in their bunks, their bodies aching, their breath fogging the air. Firewood was running low, spirits lower still. And then came the snowstorms. Days of white, endless white. Blizzards that erased the horizon. Men who wandered too far from the ship returned with frostbitten fingers, or not at all. The Discovery, once a vessel of glory, had become a floating coffin. Still, Hudson pressed on with his plans. He ordered the men to begin preparing for spring departure. He spoke of repairing sails, checking rigging, and building sledges to scout the land. But to the crew, this was delusion, madness. There was no passage, no miracle thaw waiting with a corridor to China. There was only ice, exhaustion, and a man who would not give up. Some began to believe Hudson would rather see them all die chasing his dream than return empty-handed. And in that belief, a dangerous idea took root. By February, divisions had hardened. Hudson trusted fewer and fewer of his crew. He grew suspicious, cold, withdrawn. Some said he hoarded supplies. Others said he showed favoritism, sparing rations for his son and a few chosen officers while the rest starved. The men, in turn, watched him carefully. A line had been drawn, though no one dared speak it aloud. Not yet, but everyone knew. This was not just a test of endurance anymore. It was a test of loyalty. And loyalty, like food, was in short supply. March arrived, and with it, faint signs of change. Ice cracked in the distance. Water pooled along the shore. Geese returned from the south, honking in the thin air. Hope stirred, but not of discovery. Hope that they might soon sail home. But Hudson didn't speak of going back. He spoke of pressing on, of trying again, following new leads deeper into the bay. To many aboard, that was the final straw. The map had become a mirror. Hudson looked at the ice and saw destiny. The crew looked at it and saw doom. Trapped in this frozen labyrinth, surrounded by silence and death, the men no longer feared the sea. They feared the man who would not turn away from it. And in the quiet spaces between meals and watches, between the flaring torches and freezing wind, a plan began to form. Not out of malice, not even hatred, but out of survival. The sun disappeared before Christmas. Above the Arctic Circle, the days shortened until there were none, just a long, frozen dusk. The Discovery lay trapped, encased in a cradle of ice and silence. Wind screamed across the bay, howling like a warning. Below deck, the crew waited, not for spring, but for an end. No wood, no warmth, no rescue, just darkness. The cold crept into their bones. The firewood was gone. Barrels of salted meat had begun to rot. Biscuits were crumbling to mold. Every rat aboard had long since been eaten. The men chewed leather, boiled boot soles, licked frost for moisture. And when there was nothing left to chew, they simply lay still, listening for footsteps that might bring either orders or death. Henry Hudson tried to maintain command. He still clutched his charts, scribbling by candlelight with trembling hands. He spoke of hope, of spring, of discovery. But his words rang hollow. Even his most loyal men began to look through him rather than at him. His teenage son, John, barely spoke at all. He hovered near his father, sharpening tools that wouldn't cut through ice and watching men who no longer trusted them. Outside, the world had turned to stone. The sails were frozen stiff. The rigging was coated in ice. Snow drifted in over the deck, covering barrels, boots, and bodies. To walk on shore was to risk frostbite or getting lost in the white abyss. Still, small hunting parties ventured out, returning with a few skinny hares or a frozen fox. One day, a man caught a seabird and cried when he gutted it. They fought over the bones. Inside the cramped hold, the air turned fetid. Illness spread quickly. Scurvy, fever, and despair. Gums bled. Teeth fell out. Skin yellowed. Some men hallucinated. Others sat in silence for hours, staring at nothing. Whispers began to circulate. Not about mutiny, not yet, but about abandonment. About whether their captain had led them into the wilderness to die. Whether he was willing to sacrifice every man aboard to etch his name on another map. Some even believed Hudson had no plan, that he had become unmoored from reality, a ghost pacing a dying ship. Robert Jute, once Hudson's navigator and now his bitterest critic, began keeping a separate record. He tallied who got what food, who was falling ill, who might be loyal, and who might be helpful. He didn't speak openly, but when he looked at Hudson, his expression held nothing but cold calculation. Jute had sailed on 3 of Hudson's previous voyages. He knew his brilliance and his blindness. He had seen this before, the obsession, the defiance, the refusal to turn back. But this time, Jute wasn't going to wait for the ice to melt. One day, a man collapsed while on watch. Another refused to rise from his hammock. A third was found dead, face frozen, clutching a half-eaten biscuit. The crew gathered around the stove, now little more than glowing coals, and looked at each other as though counting heads. And making decisions, something was changing. It wasn't spoken, but it was felt. The rules were shifting. Hudson sensed it too. He began isolating himself and speaking only to a few trusted men. He kept close to his son. He ordered double rations for some, denied food to others. He said it was discipline, but to the crew, it looked like favoritism. The divide widened. Those close to Hudson were seen as traitors. The rest, tired, cold, and angry, began to drift toward another center of power, Jute. The mate had no official authority, but now, when he spoke, men listened. And when Hudson issued orders, they hesitated. Control was slipping, and fear was beginning to feed on something even more dangerous than hunger: hatred. By late March, the ice began to shift. Cracks echoed across the bay. Pools of black water appeared at the shoreline. Seals returned. Geese passed overhead. Spring was coming, and with it, the chance to sail home. But not all agreed they would sail together. For some aboard the Discovery, the only way to survive was to leave the captain behind. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but as a calculation, because the most significant threat wasn't the cold. It was the man who would not turn around. The thaw came slowly. Ice groaned beneath the hull. Snow melted from the sails in rivulets. After 8 months frozen in place, the Discovery began to shift, creaking back to life, as if waking from a coma. But not all aboard were eager to move, because the moment the ship was free, a decision would have to be made: return to England or follow Hudson deeper into the north. And for many, that was no longer a debate. By April 1611, trust had evaporated. The crew had survived starvation, illness, and isolation. But Hudson, to them, had become the architect of their suffering. His refusal to turn back before winter, his hoarding of food, his blind faith in a mythical passage, all of it had transformed him in the eyes of his men. No longer an explorer, now a danger to them all. Robert Jute, once demoted for insubordination, now stood at the center of the discontent. He was not a charismatic leader. He was sharp, bitter, calculating. But in a crisis, that was enough. He had survived more Arctic voyages than any man on board, and he knew how to read people under pressure. He saw in the crew what Hudson refused to see. They were done. Jute didn't speak of mutiny. Not yet. He spoke of reason, of common sense, of the need for shared survival. And the men, one by one, began to agree. Hudson, oblivious or in denial, continued preparing for another summer of exploration. He cleaned maps, repaired tools, gave speeches about westward currents and promising inlets. He believed the crew would follow him because they had no choice. That authority, once earned, could not be questioned. But on the Discovery, authority was now fragile as spring ice. One sailor, Henry Green, had once been close to Hudson, even rescued by him from poverty and given a board position. Still, months of frost, hunger, and humiliation had eroded any sense of loyalty. Green began shadowing Jute, nodding at his complaints, agreeing with his doubts. Together, they began to speak with others, quietly, cautiously, but persistently. They didn't need to incite. They only needed to suggest. What if, when the ship was free, they set a home course? Without Hudson, some men still hesitated. Abandoning a captain was mutiny, a hanging offense. But they also knew this. No one back in England had any idea where they were. There were no patrols in Hudson Bay, no oversight, no consequences, unless someone told. And if Hudson wasn't among them when they returned, they could claim anything: ice, illness, an accident. Who would know? The ice had trapped them. Now they realized it had also freed them. As May arrived, the Discovery finally broke loose from its icy prison. Water opened around the hull. The sails were unfurled. Wind returned. It was time to sail, and it was time to choose. Hudson called a meeting. His voice, once commanding, now trembled with fatigue. He spoke of charts, untraveled rivers, and the promise of untapped lands. The crew said nothing. They stared. When he dismissed them, no one saluted. Later that night, Jute met with Green and a few others. They talked for hours in the shadows. No records exist of what was said. But afterwards, several men began sharpening knives. Others inventoried muskets. Food was gathered and hidden. The plan was simple. The act would be swift, and the judgment is final. One man, we don't know who, tried to warn Hudson. He was ignored. Others, fearing the captain might see it coming, made sure he stayed distracted. They asked him about compass bearings, about tides. They gave him back the illusion of leadership, all while preparing to take everything from him. In those final days before the mutiny, the line between survival and murder blurred. Some believed they had no choice. Others saw opportunity. But none, not even Hudson, could stop what was coming. The ship was moving again, but Hudson's journey was nearly over, and the Arctic, silent as ever, watched the final act unfold. It happened in the pale light of morning, in the stillness that comes just after the ice breaks and before the sea fully wakes. No logbook recorded the exact hour. No names were signed. But those who survived never forgot it. The mutiny on the Discovery was not a wild eruption of violence. It was calm, quiet, cold. The kind of decision that is reached slowly, wordlessly, through long stares and sleepless nights. The type of decision made when a man believes he must kill or be killed, not for glory, but for survival. Henry Hudson never saw it coming, or perhaps by the end, he did. There were signs, the silence from his men, the way they avoided his eyes, the sudden obedience after weeks of tension. Too smooth, too rehearsed. But Hudson, ever the believer in order, in rank, in destiny, clung to the illusion that a captain's authority was unshakable. He was wrong. The mutineers moved quickly. A group of them, led by Robert Jute and Henry Green, cornered Hudson as he emerged from his cabin. There was no shouting, no drawn weapons, just cold instructions. He would be placed in the ship's Shallop, a small open boat used for short trips to shore. He would be allowed food, a few supplies, and those who wished to remain loyal. And then he would be cast adrift. His teenage son, John, refused to leave his father's side. 2 or 3 crew members, loyalists or perhaps just too sick to resist, were forced into the boat with them. What was said in those final moments is lost. No pleas for mercy were recorded, no cries, only the creaking of wood, the splash of oars, and the silence of a crew watching the end of their captain from the deck of a stolen ship. The Shallop was lowered into the frigid waters of Hudson Bay. Ice still floated on the surface. The sky hung gray above. Hudson, wrapped in furs and failure, sat at the stern. His son, pale and thin, kept his eyes down. There were no sails, no charts, no compass, just a small boat, a handful of men, and the vast, merciless Arctic. And then the Discovery turned away. For a moment, the 2 vessels floated near one another, close enough to shout, to reconsider, to undo what had just been done. But no words came. No one changed their mind. The ship gathered wind, its sails snapped taut, and it began to move. Slowly at first, then steadily, southward, back toward England, back toward life. The Shallop did not follow. Hudson's last glimpse of the Discovery, the ship he had led across the world, the boat he believed would carry him into legend, was its stern disappearing into mist. The sea swallowed the wake, the ice returned, and Henry Hudson, once one of the most daring navigators of his time, became a shadow cast across the empty north. What happened next is unknown. No journals survived from the men in the Shallop. No bones were ever recovered. No cairn was ever found. The bay, massive and unforgiving, buried the evidence. Perhaps they starved. Perhaps they froze. Maybe they found land and lived for a few more days, staring at the horizon, waiting for a rescue that would never come. The mutineers would later claim they gave Hudson everything he needed to survive: food, clothing, even weapons. But their accounts are riddled with contradictions and self-preservation. The truth, like the bodies, lies somewhere beneath the ice. What's clear is this: a man was cast adrift by his own crew in the middle of an Arctic sea, thousands of miles from home, because he refused to let go of a dream. And the men who betrayed him, who abandoned their captain, their comrades, and their code, would live the rest of their lives with that silence, with that mourning, with that final image. Hudson, sitting still in a boat going nowhere. The Shallop drifted westward, swallowed by the gray expanse of Hudson Bay. No sail, no mast, only a low wooden hull and the steady slap of water against its sides. The wind whispered low across the surface, carrying no sound, no rescue, only cold. Henry Hudson was gone. There were no witnesses to what followed, no return, no message in a bottle. Only the sea, indifferent and vast, holds its secrets beneath the ice. The last we know of him is the moment his ship turned and left, and even that was recorded by the men who made it happen. The same men who, to save themselves, consigned their captain to death. The Shallop held perhaps 7 or 8 souls. Hudson, his son John. A few loyal seamen were weakened by winter. Possibly a carpenter, too ill to mutiny. They had rations for a few days. If that, some powder, a musket. No compass, no tent. And a coastline hundreds of miles wide, ringed with rocky inlets and trackless forest. There was no charted route back, no known settlement, no help. In that final wilderness, time likely broke down. Hunger would have come first, a slow twisting of the gut, a gnawing that never faded. The cold next, curling into bone and brain. By night, temperatures could still plunge below freezing. Even in spring, the Arctic was no ally. Perhaps they tried to row. Maybe they hoped to reach the shore and build shelter, to find game, to hold out until a miracle arrived. But the land was cruel. The shoreline was endless, and the bay, massive and deceptive, made every island look like the mainland, every inlet a dead end. Some have speculated that they met the Cree or Inuit, indigenous peoples of the far north who sometimes hunted along the bay. But no stories survive. No oral accounts match the timeline. If such a meeting occurred, it left no trace. More likely, they starved, or froze, or fell silent one by one, their bodies curling into the Shallop as it rocked gently on the waves. If they reached land, it was only to die beneath the open sky. The silence after the mutiny was total. None of the loyalists returned. No remains were ever recovered. Not a scrap of clothing, not a bit of wood. Only the endless water, erasing evidence, until even memory faded into myth. Back in Europe, months later, the Discovery would arrive with its survivors. But Henry Hudson had disappeared, as if the ice had opened and swallowed him whole. The crew offered explanations, carefully worded testimonies. They claimed they had no choice, that Hudson had hoarded food, that he endangered them all. They said they gave him tools, a fair chance, even mercy. But these were the words of men trying to save their own necks, and no one could verify anything because the only people who might have told the other side of the story were gone. The Shallop never came back. Not to England, not to the Bay, not to history. Only Henry Hudson's name survived, etched on rivers, straits, and maps. A monument to a man whose body was never found. A legend built on a vanishing. And yet, beneath that legend, there remains a darker truth, that exploration was never just discovery. It was dangerous, obsession, betrayal, and sometimes a boat drifting into nothing, carrying a father and son toward their final silence. The Discovery limped back into English waters in the autumn of 1611, salt-crusted, battered by storms, and manned by a skeleton crew. It was a ship carrying a void, a missing captain, a missing heir, and a story no one wanted to tell. When they docked, there was no parade, no celebration, just silence. Questions began before the ship's lines were even secured. Where was Henry Hudson? Where was his son? What had happened in the bay that bore his name? The answers came slowly, reluctantly, and with hesitation. The crew spoke of hardship, ice, and starvation. They said Hudson had endangered the mission because he had been irrational. He refused to return even when the ship was trapped in the ice. They claimed the men had no choice, that the mutiny had been a collective act of desperation. They described the casting off as tragic, but necessary. Some called it mercy. But behind the formal statements, rumors circulated. Whispers of planned betrayal, of food hoarded by the mutineers, not the captain, of a rebellion stoked long before the Thaw, and of the lingering guilt that now haunted the returning crew. The government launched an inquiry, but it was cautious, even timid. Hudson had been funded by a group of private backers, not the Crown. And in the eyes of English authorities, there was little appetite to prosecute the only surviving witnesses to a failed expedition. Without hard evidence, without bodies, without a logbook from Hudson himself, it was one man's word against another. And most of the mutineers stuck to the same story. Robert Jute, the man widely believed to have orchestrated the rebellion, didn't survive long. Within a few months of returning, he was dead. Of illness, some said, but others whispered it was despair or punishment by another hand. Henry Green, another key mutineer, had never returned. He had been killed by indigenous warriors near the end of the voyage during a skirmish in James Bay. His body, unlike Hudson's, was at least accounted for. For the rest of the crew, their lives faded quietly. Some returned to sea. Others disappeared into poverty. None gained wealth or fame. The voyage had taken more than their captain. It had taken their future. As the years passed, the story of the Discovery's final voyage became a cautionary tale, not of ice or failure, but of betrayal. Explorers in later generations spoke of Hudson with awe, a martyr to ambition, a symbol of what happened when dreams collided with the limits of human endurance. His name was given to bays, rivers, and straits, vast bodies of water that outlived the man who had once dared to cross them. And yet, the mutineers were never officially punished. No one was hanged. No trials were held. Their guilt, if it existed, lived only in their memories, and in the uncomfortable silence that followed their return. History turned the page. But the stain remained, because they had come home, and their captain had not. Henry Hudson died with no final words, no grave, and no witness to mark the moment. Yet somehow his name survived, etched into coastlines, rivers, and bays that still bear his imprint centuries later. He vanished into the icy north, leaving behind a legacy shaped not only by discovery, but also by mystery, failure, and betrayal. He had set out to redraw the map of the world, and in a way, he did. The Hudson River, a wide, majestic artery cutting through the heart of what would become New York, served as a foundation of Dutch colonization in North America. A century after Hudson sailed for the Dutch East India Company in 1609, its banks would host a global trading hub, one of the most important cities in the modern world. That river carried his name long before it carried the weight of empires. Then there's Hudson Bay, the inland sea he believed would be his passage to Asia. He wasn't the first to see it, but he was the first to chart it with such purpose, to sail into its heart and stake his life on what he believed it concealed. Ironically, the very place that would be named for him is also the place that swallowed him whole. And farther north, Hudson Strait, that narrow, ice-choked passage that separates the Arctic islands from mainland Canada. The entryway into that fatal voyage still bears his mark. These places became more than geography. They became monuments, even tombstones, carved in ice. But how should history remember the man behind the name? To some, Henry Hudson was a visionary, a relentless navigator who chased the unknown with courage others lacked. He was a man who refused to turn back, who believed in discovery even when the maps failed him. His voyages pushed the limits of European knowledge farther than almost any other of his time. To others, he was reckless, obsessed, blinded by ambition. He ignored warnings, risked his crew, sacrificed prudence for pride. His stubbornness, they say, was not bravery. It was arrogance, and it got him, and others, killed. And then some see Hudson as a victim, not of the sea, but of the men who followed him. Betrayed by his own crew, cast into the wilderness, he devoted his life to exploring. Abandoned not for failure, but because he refused to compromise his goal. He may have misjudged the ice, but the final cruelty came not from nature, but from human hands. What complicates his legacy is the silence. Hudson left behind no memoirs. His logs were brief, technical, and ended when the Shallop slipped away. All we know comes through others, men who had every reason to justify their actions and reshape the tale. His son John, just a boy, perished with him, and so the father's story was never defended. In that silence, myth grew. Painters imagined his final moments. Poets mourned him as a tragic figure. Historians debated his sanity, his skill, his fate. And yet, for all the books written and all the debates held, no one has ever found his bones. Perhaps that's what makes his story so enduring. Henry Hudson is not just a man lost to time. He is a question left unanswered. What drives a person to sail beyond the edge of the known world? When does perseverance become self-destruction? How thin is the line between greatness and ruin? In the age of empire, exploration was often framed as conquest of land, of people, of oceans. But Hudson's story is different. It was not a tale of conquest. It was a journey inward, into the human capacity for belief, for ambition, for betrayal. A reminder that discovery is not always a triumph. Sometimes it ends in a boat adrift, in cold silence, with nothing left but a name. Henry Hudson's final voyage wasn't just a failed expedition. It was a turning point. A story that marks the uneasy boundary between exploration and exploitation, between the pursuit of knowledge and the price of obsession. It was, in many ways, the birth of imperial ambition in ice. By the early 1600s, Europe was hungry, not just for gold or spices, but for control of trade routes, sea lanes, and the unknown. Empires weren't only built in tropical colonies and coastal ports. They were carved into maps, claimed with ink and wind and stubbornness. And the Arctic, with its blinding whiteness and phantom promises, became a canvas for those imperial dreams. Hudson was part of that hunger. He wasn't a king or a general. He was a tool of empire, a navigator hired by men in velvet chairs to turn risk into riches. If he succeeded, entire nations would profit. If he failed, he would vanish quietly, as he did, into the cold. His voyage was financed not by royalty, but by private investors, businessmen who cared less about glory than return on investment. The Arctic, to them, was a gamble, a high-risk, high-reward venture that might cut months off the journey to Asia. That logic, of short-term gain over human cost, would echo for centuries in the age of colonization. And it was that very pressure, the expectation of discovery, the fear of failure, the allure of wealth, that pushed Hudson too far. He wasn't simply following a compass. He was chasing a prize, a passage that might never have existed, but that he was convinced lay just beyond the next bend. When he refused to turn back, when he insisted on pressing deeper into the bay, even as the ice closed in, it wasn't just arrogance. It was a man trapped in the machinery of imperial ambition, a man who could not afford to fail, who would rather risk death than return empty-handed. That's the part of the story history often overlooks. The system that made men like Hudson disposable. For every explorer who returned a hero, countless others vanished. Their names became footnotes. Their bones never recovered. Hudson's mutineers sailed home not to punishment, but to shrugs. Because in the eyes of their sponsors, the voyage had simply ended. But what they brought back, even in failure, was something larger than gold or silk. They brought maps. They brought knowledge. They brought the first steps of the empire into the Arctic. In the decades that followed, English fur traders and French missionaries would pour into the regions Hudson had charted. The bay would become a hub of commerce and colonial tension. Entire indigenous nations, Cree, Inuit, Dane, would be drawn into a geopolitical struggle they never asked for. It began, in part, with Hudson's journey. His name became a brand, a signal that the English had staked a claim, not just on land, but on narrative. Yet behind that name was a chilling irony. The man it commemorates was abandoned, lost, forgotten, the first casualty of an empire that hadn't even arrived yet. In that way, Hudson's story is not simply about ice and death. It's about a system that devoured the people it used, a system that demanded discovery, punished hesitation, and rewarded betrayal, as long as someone came home with a map. And so the ship sails on, in history's imagination. The Discovery, leaving behind its captain, a shallop adrift, a name carved into coastlines, and the memory of a man who chased the edge of the world and found the edge of himself.